Welcome back to Spare a Thought, the podcast for curious minds exploring creativity, culture, and stories from the margins. I'm your host, Tom Spare. Between 2023 and 2024, I studied an MA in Political Communication at Cardiff University School of Journalism, Media and Culture. The question of who owns the media and what that means for the rest of us became the driving force behind creating this podcast, Spare a Thought. Today, I want to explore who owns the media and why understanding media ownership helps our understanding of the world. My guest today is Steven Renderos, Executive Director of MediaJustice, a US-based racial justice organization that advances the media and technology rights of people of color. Steven grew up in Los Angeles in an immigrant household at a time when anti-immigrant politics were shaping everything from the news to the ballot box. That experience of seeing the media tell a story that bore no resemblance to his own life puts him on a path that he continues to walk to this day. Over the past decade, Steven has led campaigns that have lowered the cost of prison phone calls, secured net neutrality rules, and got Donald Trump kicked off Twitter. He's a regular commentator in the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the Guardian. He's also a podcaster and a DJ. We're going to be talking about MediaJustice's report, Media Capture: Who Controls the Story Controls the Future, a deep dive into how a small group of tech oligarchs are consolidating control over America's media system and the wider media environment across the world. Jeff Bezos, Larry Ellison, Elon Musk, just to name a few. So we get into all of that. Just as a side note, Steven has also contributed to a recent episode of the Political Dispatch, our sister show, All the President's Men at 50, where Steven contributes by asking, would a Watergate-style investigation happen today? Could it happen today? There's a link to that episode in the show notes. Back to this episode, just a word of warning, my internet connection was a little ropey, so every now and then Steven cuts out just for short moments. But overall, the content and discussion are really rich. So let's get into it and ask, who owns the media?
I'm Steven Renderos, and I'm the executive director of a US-based racial justice organization called MediaJustice. And I'll talk a little bit about MediaJustice in a sec. I think I'll say by way of introduction for myself, I was born in the United States, but to immigrant parents. I grew up in a neighborhood of Los Angeles called Koreatown in Los Angeles, California. My family is Salvadorian, and I grew up in a Los Angeles and in a California in the kind of mid to late 1980s that was actually pretty anti-immigrant, pretty xenophobic at that time. And, I grew up watching how the media talked about immigrants at that time, from political attack ads to news stories. And I think I learned very quickly that the news that I saw didn't really conform or didn't align with my experience in my home. I realized that representation in the media and the experience of growing up in an immigrant household were two different things. And that kind of disconnect is really what put me on this path. I've always been very curious to shape the story and understanding, not just of myself, but of the people that I come from. And that kind of fascination, whether that was creating video book reports in high school when I was, asked to write about a book, or did community radio in college, to when I became a community organizer after college working for a tenants union. I've always had this fascination of shaping and controlling the story. So even as I was doing community organizing at this tenants union, I was kind of our de facto PR person at my organization. I was the one publishing press releases about our campaigns because I always understood it's important to tell your own story. It's real power. And so that's always been kind of carried through for me. And that's how I found MediaJustice, or maybe better put, I think in many ways, MediaJustice, the organization, found me in 2008. There was a conference that was taking place in a city called Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I was living at the time. And there was a gathering of media justice activists, and I'd never heard the term media justice, but I had a friend who told me, you should be in this room. it seems to really align with all the things you care about. And I walked in, and the founder of our organization, Malkia Devich Cyril, was in the front of the room talking about this political framework called media justice. And, I think what I experienced that day when I walked into that room was someone really putting to words something that I've felt probably all of my life. And so I've been at this organization since February of 2012. And so that's coming on 14 years, and I haven't left yet. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's good sign in itself that you've sort of stayed for that length of time and had that association. And I guess I'm right. Media Justice was founded in 2002. So when you first experienced it, I suppose it was still a relatively new organization at that point. How have you seen the organization, if any, change in that time that you've been there?
In the simplest way, I think what's changed is the information ecosystem around us. In 2002, when Media Justice was formed, this was at a time in which it was really a few years into some pretty significant levels of media consolidation that were happening in our media ecosystem, largely led by, wireless companies like AT&T, who were becoming these kinds of not just uh, a cell phone provider and a telephone provider, but also media companies. And we were seeing the same kind of consolidation happening within the cable industry. And so these media giants were emerging in this at this time. And so those were the big giants that we were fighting. And when Media Justice was founded in the early 2000s, a lot of the early campaigns were trying to stop the sale of the local Black-owned hip-hop station to the large media conglomerate Clear Channel. And so that's kind of the ecosystem we were fighting, were these large media companies. Part of what happened throughout our history is I came in also kind of at a time in which the internet was this kind of emerging force that was changing the way that communications happened in our society. And in the early days, actually democratizing who could actually tell their stories and actually reach people. You can think back, when I joined Media Justice in 2012, that I had been involved even before then through our national network. You were seeing things emerge like the Arab Spring, which very much leveraged technologies like social media platforms like Twitter to make their voices heard. Seeing the emergence of online conversations like hashtag Black Lives Matter, translate into offline social movements that, had real bases of people attached to them. So we saw what happens when technology and media that is in our hands is able to be wielded and controlled. And so there was a sort of a sweet spot, I think, when the internet was a democratizing force. And then in many ways, the digital media landscape went the way of traditional media and just became consolidated. So in a weird way, what I've noticed throughout my history is sort of a return to the original conditions that sparked an organization like Media Justice to exist in the first place, which was fighting the heavy concentration and control of media and technology. I think what feels different in this moment is we definitely see that the media barons of today are very different. They are large scale tech oligarchs, people like Larry Ellison and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, who have made a deliberate choice actually invest in both traditional and digital media and capturing it, because the control over that media infrastructure equals power. But they also are leveraging control over the digital infrastructure that shapes the internet. And that's the build out of massive data centers that are, being built in this moment across the US, but also globally to fuel, the ambitions of AI companies like Google and Meta and OpenAI. And so the control of that digital infrastructure is also very key to this new kind of form of media baron. And the last thing is leveraging both the kind of traditional and digital media infrastructure, the data infrastructure, to then continue continue expanding operations of surveillance to capture more and more data. And we see the kind of those three things really operating in unison with each other to create a kind of single system of control. So while today, like part of what feels the same as what did in the early 2000s is a heavy concentration of the infrastructure that shapes meaning in our society being held by very few people. But what feels different is, now that infrastructure is being leveraged to control the data infrastructure that powers AI, but also to expand surveillance in our society. And they're actually all interrelated. And people like Larry Ellison, in many ways, like fit all three. They are wielding their power across all three fronts. And to me today, the battle for media justice is to fight on all three of those fronts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's obviously like in the 19th century, you had like the media barons, that owned the newspapers and owned news in that sense. But this is very much something different because, as you explain, these are people that own the infrastructure that supports those media environments. So, like Larry Ellison, and we'll talk about him later, owns Oracle, or that's where he made his money. But then Oracle is very essential for the running of other elements of AI and other sort of digital infrastructure as well. And it's quite a small cabal when you actually dig into who owns what companies. Once you follow the sort of the trail of the actual owner, you're looking at in the hands of like 10 people or something silly like that, So so it's interesting how that shifted, and the number of media companies that exist has sort of decreased because although you have brands that sit on top of it, if you look at like the Warner Brothers deal, they own CNN, for example, a large stake in CNN, and the Ellisons already own CBS, and that's sort of mentioned in the report as well. So the tech oligarchs, as you say in the report, are consolidating control over America's media system. And they're betting that we won't notice, or we'll feel too powerless to stop it. But as you say in the report, 200 years of movement history says otherwise. So you've said that you have to fight on multiple fronts. What does that look like in reality? What does that say about where we are right now and how it's resisted, I guess?
I think thinking about that long arc of history, I think in many ways, believing that the aims of like the tech oligarchs won't meet any kind of resistance is a real bet on their part, right? That if they keep consolidating the media system, if they keep building out, and just force the build out of these large hyperscale data centers, if control of the social media algorithms that people are using to truth to power, that they will get to a scale and a size where they feel too big to fight. I think that's really like the bet that they're making. And I think history has proven that wrong consistently. I think I wrote about this a little bit in the report, but the very first Black newspaper in the United States was the Freedom's Journal, which was published in 1827. That's actually the same year that New York State, where the newspaper was based, actually abolished slavery. And in the opening line of their publication, they said, "We wish to plead our own cause. Far too long have others spoken for us." And you think about the audacity of like that being kind of the very first thing you write and you publish as a Black newspaper, the first Black newspaper in the United States, where slavery has just been abolished, and the audacity of that thought, right? To believe that Black people had a right to speak for themselves. And one of the very first things that was done in the kind of aftermath of abolishing slavery in New York was to build Black-owned information infrastructure, because they were existing in a world that was entirely designed to exclude them. And that newspaper created a wave of like other Black-owned newspapers, but also newspapers The very first Spanish language newspaper in the U.S. was in the mid 1800s as well. The first, uh, indigenous run newspaper was with the Cherokee tribe in the South. And uh, abolitionist newspapers popped up all over the place during that time and very much became like the infrastructure that created the ideological case to abolish slavery in the country overall. And so the ability to actually own and control and fight for our own information infrastructure has always been key, to fighting for the justice that we feel in our society, that we want to see make happen. And so even up against like pretty significant odds, you know, people of color have always found a way. I think about this with Ida B. Wells, who was a pioneering journalist here and across the South, and actually made a home here in Chicago, where I live now, and is widely revered. But she wrote a lot about the kind of white violence across the South during the age of Reconstruction after the U.S. Civil War, um, and wrote a lot about those lynchings. That reporting made her a target. Her newspaper, the Memphis Free, their offices were burned down by a white mob. It didn't stop her from doing that reporting. She still went on and did it. And and I think that's what I think about these moments where you have these giants and this opposition that believes that people will just relent. I think history has taught us that people will always find a way to resist, and I see that happening right now, actually, across the U.S. with the build out of these data centers, where um, I'm an organizer by trade, and so anytime I see hundreds of people showing up to a city council meeting in a really small town in a rural state, uh, it perks my ears up because it says that something is resonating um, beyond the consensus, and people are fighting back against the will of these tech oligarchs that are trying, and that's why they're trying to control the media system, because the public consensus is not on their side. Um, and I think what it says in this moment is that deeper entrenchment and a deeper desire to consolidate power on the hands of, like, today's media barons or tech oligarchs, is going to be met with real resistance. And it's a really ripe time for the kind of organizing that we do. It excites me, actually, to be doing the work that I'm doing, because I think I'll find people, that are very much like I was in the early 2000s, trying to make a way and trying to tell my own story. I think there's a lot of people like me out there who, in this moment, are looking for that kind of political home to be doing work to transform the information ecosystems around them.
Yeah, and I think data centers is a very good example, because they're often placed in rural communities, smaller communities where there's large Black communities, poorer communities. With I assume with the assumption that there won't be as much resistance there, or these are forgotten places, so people won't hear about what's going on. And as a result, these data centers are polluting the local areas, waterways. They're actually extracting huge amounts of water, and which is ecological disaster, basically. And it's interesting you say about those town halls or local meetings are getting big chunks of the community activated. And that's also my thought about the responses to the administration. I think that a lot of people are being they're awakening, or they're being radicalized because they realize that their lives and their existence are under threat. This isn't just a thing of this is a minor inconvenience. It means they might not be able to have running water, or that the waterways are being polluted because they're not using solar to power these places. They're using really fossil fuel and all that sort of thing. But it's interesting you say about, like, people telling stories. So the report subtitle is "Who Controls the Story Controls the Future." Can you unpack that a little bit about why you chose that as a subtitle for the report?
And I'll maybe answer that by way of kind of connecting it to my own journey. So, I mentioned earlier that I grew up in a pretty anti-immigrant California, um, where politicians were very adept at using immigrants as political pawns, right? And using criminalizing narratives to rally votes. Um, and that playbook of, you know, me seeing these kind of political attack ads, you know, that depicted immigrants flooding borders and saying like these are the immigrants that are bringing in diseases, they're criminals, they don't belong here, they make us less safe. That's a story that has been perpetuated and repeated uh, my entire life. And I've seen it evolve from like being used to win elections in California to making it to the national debate stage. And immigration has consistently been kind of a flashpoint topic, continues to be in this very moment. There's entire media infrastructure, particularly on the right, that's been built to perpetuate that story, large scale echo chambers. And the thing is, like, if you keep repeating that line, like immigrants are criminals, they bring in diseases, they make us less safe. If that's the story you're able to repeat and you're building up the infrastructure that allows you to reach massive audiences, um, eventually what happens is that that message then justifies some of the horrendous things that happen to immigrants. And I think about this in this last year, what I've seen in the United States with the large scale immigration enforcement actions that have taken place. Um, you know, that story of the criminals and the people that are making us less safe is justifying thousands of federal police agents going across the country and just snatching people off the streets. Here at where I live in Chicago, in the neighborhood that I live in, it was very much the epicenter of a lot of these enforcement actions. And I saw street vendors get snatched off the street. I saw parents get snatched from their car who were dropping off their kids at school. In one kind of case here in Chicago, federal immigration officials went into a daycare and took someone who was taking care of kids. Um, and so, you know, the story, which has been built up over decades, talking about immigrants in this very kind of negative way, very much created the conditions that then made this political and material reality happen. And I think what's been interesting to see, so in that way, controlling the story and the way that it's been controlled definitely shapes what happened in the future, what happened in this moment. And I think the wave of that kind of storytelling over many decades, repeating the same false story, um, has created the moment that we're in now. But what's been interesting, I think, for me in this moment also is seeing how, faced with the reality of that dehumanization, how people have reacted. I think there's almost been kind of like a waking up on many people that maybe I'm not as bought into these criminalizing immigrant narratives as I thought I was. And I see that here in Chicago, especially in the parts of the city that tend to be a little more conservative, who have reacted to these major large scale federal immigration operations by saying like, actually, that's what we signed up for. And the conditions that people are facing every day, economic depression, struggling to get by, like, you can't blame all of that stuff on immigrants. And I think people are waking up to a reality that, probably some of the rich billionaires who are allied with our current president, they might have a lot to do with the fact that we don't have enough resources for everybody to have jobs, to pay for their homes, for all of that. But that is why I think like the possibility of transforming our society in a way that really works for everyone does really rely upon our ability to control the infrastructure that shapes us. If we're able to do that, then I think we are able to move us towards a trajectory that shapes a better future for all of us. So it's that subtitle was both kind of indicating like what are the conditions that we're in now, but also the answer to what we do to change that. It's us controlling the story. It's us controlling then the future.
One thing that you mentioned there about, the ice raids, for example, which when I saw those initial videos, I just couldn't process it from what I was seeing. Similar when I saw the January 6th uprising in the capital, these are moments that you think, I can't process what I'm seeing. And then you see it more and more.
I think part of the challenge is like, how is it possible that those images are happening? And part of the answer is when you build up a narrative of criminalizing people and rendering certain people as like as these monsters, right? You are going to find an audience for that out there. And so many, I would say, like many of these ICE agents have probably been driven by their own, like, not entirely, but some of them, like, certainly driven by their own kind of anti-immigrant views that have been stoked by those narratives, which makes it, when you look at an immigrant, you don't see them in their full humanity. And so in some ways, I think about the the impact of our media ecosystem on the people that are being driven into ICE professions right now and going out there and working for ICE, and how they've been shaped in a certain way. And certainly, I think out in communities, seeing people kind of have their perceptions jarred a bit because, yeah, it's easy to be socialized to believe that certain people don't belong here, and then when you see what's actually happening, when you start to feel the impact of it, that it's not just the worst of the worst, as politicians like to say it is. It's actually the person who serves you your food at the restaurant. It's the person who takes care of your kids. It's the person who drives you around in the Uber. When it's those people that are being impacted and you have to feel that loss day to day, it does, what's been sobering is to see people turn towards a more really sort of way, a more community sort of way to say, no, actually, like, those are our people. And I think it makes me hopeful for the kinds of kind of coalitions that we can form in this moment that are not just purely shaped by two political parties, but it's really driven by something else, which is like our relationship to each other.
Yeah. What I find very interesting, so I didn't grow up in Wales, I grew up in Dover, which has a pretty large white population, has a very busy port. So, and it's on the front line, as it were, of immigration, because it's where people a process come through. We have a lot of, nowhere near the scale of the US border in terms of number of people crossing, but thousands of people every year are coming over on boats from France, only like 21 miles at the closest point. So on a sunny day like this, when it's quite still, a lot of people are coming over. But the reality of how numbers in comparison to total immigration is very small. But right-wing media will present it as a different thing entirely. They will latch on to the worst case scenarios and stories. And also what I find very interesting is that people who are consuming right-wing media will repeat all the talking points of those outlets. And like, for example, in the UK, it's like stop the boat is a big talking point. But when you question them on those talking points, they'll talk about the people in their local communities who are their barbers or who work in the NHS or who own the local corner shop. And they really like those people. But on the other set, and they're repeating these talking points. So there's like this disconnect between what people actually are like day to day versus what they're repeating. And I find that it's sort of almost like brainwashing.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, there's the Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci who talked about, how do you wield power over people? And his theory of hegemony was one in which he believed that, like, power in a society, yes, it's wielded by force, right? Through armies and, police forces and through brute force, brute strength. But there's a soft power that's also built through shaping the systems that create meaning in our society, the media system, churches, schools, all are sites where it helps us understand how the world works. Everybody is constantly searching for like how to understand the world around them, whether that's the immediate world of your neighborhood or the country that you're in or the region or, or the hemisphere or the world or the universe. Like there is this kind of desire to like better understand. Therefore, institutions that are designed to try to kind of fill the gap play an incredibly important role. It's also a site of power. Um, and so that disconnect, where people aren't able to their own lived experiences every day to what are the messages that are being distributed to them across the media that they consume. It's because there is a political agenda that's being driven through that media infrastructure. It's not as obvious, it's not as direct in many cases, but it's there. And it makes that we're unable to connect the dots between what we see in our everyday lives to how we make meaning in terms of what that means for the world around us. And that's been, a huge failure of a corporate media ecosystem, but also just a huge failure of media in general, because over history, it's who owns that infrastructure that actually wields an incredible amount of power. I think you were referencing some of the like the media barons of the 1800s, like the William Randolph Hearst, the big newspaper giants, who literally incited the United States to get into a war, the Spanish-American War. He wanted to see that happen. He used his newspaper infrastructure to make it happen. And so who actually owns the infrastructure, the media infrastructure in our society really counts for a lot in terms of how those gaps get filled in our understanding of the world around us. And yeah, I think it's part of the work that we need to be doing to try to transform that for sure.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I think it's probably worth moving on about media ownership and giving some like tangible examples, because we've mentioned some names already. Jeff Bezos is a good one to start with. So he bought the Washington Post, the owner of Amazon, bought the Washington Post in 2013 and was initially sort of credited with reviving the paper. But by early 2026 this year, following non-endorsement of Kamala Harris and recent layoffs of 300 journalists, that sort of savior narrative has dissolved. What has changed in that time of Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post to 13 years later, where he's sort of laying off a lot of the journalists?
So with Jeff Bezos, at the time that he bought the Washington Post, journalism had been going through a major economic crisis, trying to figure out how it adapts to a very changing landscape and how people receive information, right? So like the ad-driven newspaper business like didn't really conform to a moment in which the internet allowed people to access information a lot more easily than they had before. And I think many legacy newspapers took a really long time to adapt to that growing new reality. Um, and so at the time that Jeff Bezos buys the Washington Post, there's a belief that like, oh, yes, this is a model that can work. Here are these tech guys who made their money in the dot-com era or in the age of platforms who have like a wealth of resources that they can pour towards saving these legacy institutions and revitalizing journalism in our society. And I think if you had judged that story by what Jeff Bezos did over the first few years, you might find yourself validated, right? The newsroom grew, digital subscriptions grew. Um, they figured out a way to kind of adapt to a kind of digital landscape and seeing visitors to their websites grow. And so we got a lot of credit for rescuing the paper. But I think part of what happened is initially, Jeff Bezos was a hometown kid from the area, bought the newspaper, of record that he remembers growing up. So it was a kind of a vanity, almost nostalgic purchase, um, in the way that someone who might be going through a midlife crisis might buy a sports car, right? Because of how rich he is, he gets to buy the Washington Post. Um, and they were allowed to kind of do what they wanted to do. But, a few things changed over the course of his ownership. Trump 1.0 happened. And, in 2016, Trump is elected. And we experienced 4 years of Trump where the Washington Post actually did leverage their critical coverage of Trump as a real, as a real selling point. That was their slogan during that time was democracy dies in darkness. And that did not curry any favors with Trump and with the base people, coalition of people behind him. And at a certain point, that that kind of distrust in the Washington Post and that negative perception that Trump had of that newspaper um, started impacting Jeff Bezos and other businesses. So the altruistic part of him that might have bought the newspaper because that was his childhood newspaper, that changed because at the end of the day, what Jeff Bezos has always been is a capitalist who is interested in preserving his own businesses. And I think part of like what I've really rejected about kind of the lionization and almost the propping up on a pedestal all of these like tech oligarchs at various different times. There was a moment in which Jeff Bezos was the person in the sun, and I think today we'd say that like people like Sam Altman have gotten that similar kind of treatment of like the wonder kid who can do no wrong. And I think it sort of obfuscates their real motivations. They're seen as geniuses who can do no wrong, but really like they're driven in very individualistic sort of ways. And so, what we saw there at the Post is one of the first kind of major consequential decisions where he stepped in and leveraged his power as the owner of the paper, is to stop the Washington Post from publishing a presidential endorsement in 2024 elections. So Kamala Harris was due to be endorsed by the Washington Post, and he personally killed it. Um, of course, like whether you think it's related or not, but hours later, like Jeff Bezos's space company Blue Origin is meeting with Trump to kind of curry favor because they had a massive contract with the federal government at the time. And so, and then, obviously you referenced the cuts that they made. The cuts that they made, I think, are very deliberate also to kind of prove also like who's affected when these things happen. They cut the Middle East bureau. They cut the metro section, which Washington, D.C. is a historically Black city. So, for the historically Black residents of that community, they no longer have adequate coverage of what's happening in their neighborhoods. And then they gutted the kind of opinion editorial section, completely transformed it by bringing in more conservative voices. So, in a way, I think what we're seeing is the altruism really has a shelf life. If it ends up impacting the tech oligarch's bottom line, things will change. And I would say like the changes that Jeff Bezos has made to the Washington Post, it's probably actually been to the detriment of the newspaper. I mean, they've lost subscribers left and right, but I think Jeff Bezos is willing to eat the cost of that newspaper really losing its impact, so long as it puts him in a good light with the politician that he's trying to appeal to. So that is part of the danger of like having these rich capitalists in charge of these media institutions. They will ultimately make decisions that benefit themselves more so than anybody else.
Yeah, of course. And as you say in the report, the price of the bailout is editorial control. So you're sort of like, you're passing over control to the owner and the whims of the owner. And as you say, their business interests. And if they want to curry favor with the administration, they'll put that before the integrity of the readership and the journalists that work there. You've mentioned in the report also about, when media outlets are bought or bailed out by wealthy owners, you argue that it's people, communities of color who lose their voice first. So you gave the example there of the metro section in Washington, D.C. What does that look like in practice, and which sort of stories or areas of coverage disappear?
One of the things that we point to in the report is like part of how that influence and control happens, in addition to like just straight up acquisitions that then lead to these kinds of sweeping changes we see internally, like we saw at the Washington Post with Jeff Bezos, or like what we saw at CBS News when Larry Ellison, Larry Ellison and the company that he was funding purchased Paramount, which owns CBS News. The kind of gutting that happened inside of that news organization, the changing editorial guidelines, the installing of an editor-in-chief from a right-wing paper. So there's that way, which those kinds of changes have had detrimental effects to the kind of coverage that happens about Black people and brown folks in our communities here in the United States. But I think something else that we actually talk about in the report is how tech companies have actually been very deliberate about getting in the way of any kind of policy or legislation that would regulate them. And, for example, in the report, we talk about a piece of legislation that was moving in California that would have taxed companies, like platforms like Google and Facebook, because of the impact that those platforms have on local newsrooms, Black-owned, Latinx-owned newsrooms from being reached by people who are trying to reach them because of how those platforms are designed to essentially inoculate that kind of traffic. And we're seeing that happen also more and more now with like AI search results. When you go to Google, instead of directing you to articles that you're searching for, it's just giving you information up front. So it also prevents you from getting there. So there's legislation in California that would have played a role in taxing these platforms to then help to fund these local newsrooms. And instead, Google and Facebook threatened to block all of those websites from their platforms. They leveraged their kind of hard control over their platforms to say, don't regulate us, otherwise, we'll block you, and then no one will reach you. And that threat actually worked. Yeah, politicians actually pulled the deal back and instead negotiated, some funding from Google to help, provide grants to local newsrooms. But part of what happened there at the end of that story is within a couple years, even though Google had committed to funding the kind of journalism fund for 10 years, after 3 years, they pulled out. And now the funding that was going to Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and rural outlets, all of a sudden that money dried out. And those institutions are now faced with real challenges to exist. And we're seeing every day, like there's that infrastructure is going away. There's a Black-owned newspaper in Portland, Oregon, called the Portland Scanner, that closed earlier this year, and they'd been around for 50 years. We had the Richmond Free Press, another Black-owned newspaper, that closed after 34 years. And the publisher of the Free Press put it pretty plainly. He said corporations have ceased to take seriously or care about the Black community. The resourcing is not there. And so, I think as we've seen the kind of digital landscape continue to consolidate, it's had a detrimental effect to Black and brown owned media institutions that are trying to survive at the moment. And those that are able to adapt, as we write about in the report, through like AI partnerships, are the bigger, more well-resourced news organizations that can afford to do so. But it's our communities that are on the losing end.
Could you talk a little, very briefly, about the AI partnership side of stuff? So I listened to a interview not so long ago with the CEO of The Atlantic, who struck a deal with OpenAI that OpenAI would pay The Atlantic for use of their journalistic work, so it would push up sort of like credit the journalists in their searches. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it's big companies that are being advantaged from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful to kind of look at it from two different ends. So, what are the motivations of the AI companies? For them, because of the versions of artificial intelligence that are being built in our society right now, large language models, they actually rely upon an ever increasing amount of data. So the large language model is only as good as much as it can continue to grow and expand its data set, which is why you're also seeing the kind of tension of building out hyperscaler data centers all over the country. Because if you're going to have like larger data sets, you're going to need more computers to store all that data. So the AI companies need more data. Where can you find more data? And that's where news organizations can actually play a role. News organizations every single day, because of journalistic practices, are constantly producing news stories. So they have access to the kind of data that many of these AI companies want. News organizations, on the other hand, are in a challenging financial crunch in many cases. And so what they have faced, as I was mentioning earlier, is a depression in web traffic that's coming to their website. And that's in large part because of platforms that have leveraged artificial intelligence tools to generate, search summaries like with Google that then make it so that the user never actually makes it to the news website. So seeing that drop off, which I think in the report we talk about it as in many news organizations, they've seen a drop off of like up to 25% in their user traffic, which then affects their ability to generate revenue from advertising. That a real impact, and it's put them in a financial crunch. So you have this valuable data set that you're sitting on. And so what many news organizations are opting to do is to make deals, cut deals with AI companies. The New York Times famously, they sued OpenAI because OpenAI had scraped some of their data, but then they turned around and cut a deal with Amazon for, a couple $100 million, to have access to its large archive. And so yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of a symbiotic relationship right now between the licensing deals and the news organizations. I think the thing that troubles me about it is that this is also in a moment in which AI probably needs to be highly scrutinized in our society, and the infrastructure or the institutions that should do that organizations are not as well positioned to do that. But in many ways, they're compromised. They're compromised because of the financial ties they have to many of these companies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the people that the guardians and the guardrails in the papers and in the media just aren't there because they're compromised basically in their relationship. So you've got these three strategies of like ownership, financial influence, and then platform control. So working as a single system. And Larry Ellison is perhaps the clearest example of that. Could you tell us about Larry Ellison, his acquisition of Paramount, and now Warner Brothers via his son David Ellison? Can you talk about the Ellisons a bit and who they are and what their strategy is? You sort of mentioned previously about it, but I think it's worth being explicit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so Larry Ellison is the founder of Oracle. He was briefly the richest person on earth sometime last year. Personally, he put up about $6 billion of the $8 billion deal to finance the acquisition of Paramount. So the company that his son, David, runs, Skydance, purchased Paramount last year for $8 billion. And the bulk of that money came from Larry Ellison. So Larry Ellison done control CBS News, as I was mentioning earlier. They installed, this sort of conservative right-wing figure, Barry Weiss, to run it. In the year or so that person has been installed at CBS News, we've seen stories suppressed, like a story famously that was well documented last year, a 60 Minutes segment that was covering the really terrible treatment of Venezuelan migrants that were deported from the United States to El Salvador to the horrendous Secot prison. Barry White stepped in to suppress that story from being published for a period of time because it didn't position the Trump administration in the most favorable light. You know, what they exposed those Venezuelan towards was horrendous. He's also done a lot to attack DEI programs internally and just dismantle all of their kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. So that's what he's doing kind of on the media side. Larry Ellison also, through Oracle, now has control over TikTok's algorithm. So there was a joint venture that took ownership over the US portion of TikTok, and Oracle itself got a 15% ownership stake. They have a board seat. They also have direct control over the storage of all of TikTok's data and its algorithm. So its actual news feed. So owns CBS News, but now also has control over what, we have 170 plus million TikTok users in the United States. So really controlling what those folks get to see. And, of course, this is anecdotally, but there's been a lot of anecdotal evidence of just seeing the impact of what's happened on the TikTok algorithm. Many people have talked about, content that was critical of Trump and ICE, really not making it through the feeds. And then, of course, we have the Warner Brothers Discovery deal that's coming up now. It's a $110 billion purchase of a pretty large scale movie studio, but that also has connected media properties, including CNN and HBO and MTV. And that deal very much looks like it will close because Larry Ellison, among many other things, is also a pretty consistent and valued supporter of Donald Trump. And so the regulatory hurdles that most other companies would have to go through, it doesn't seem like they will face that much scrutiny at all.
Yeah. And he's perhaps he's becoming more exposed in terms of he's getting more screen time, whereas in the past he probably sailed under the radar. That's ultimate power, isn't it? When you sail under the radar and you can get on with your Machiavellian ways without people noticing. Any final thoughts before we finish?
I think there's always real power in seeing media as a site of struggle. And, our history as an organization has been one in which we've been trying to build the case for that and trying to build a movement around it that can really push and fight for the kind of media and technology that we want in our society. I think this is the moment of awakening for a lot of people where the historical consensus is waning. And so we'd be excited to connect with anybody who, whether you're waking up to a data center that's being built in your backyard or a ever-growing consolidated media ecosystem, we'd be interested in make connections and kind of connect struggles across regions, so that we can build the kind of movement that can make it so that figures like Larry Ellison and Rupert Murdoch and Elon Musk don't have to actually shape the world around us.
That was Steven Renderos, Executive Director of MediaJustice. I'll link to MediaJustice's report, Media Capture, Who Controls the Story Controls the Future, in the show notes. It's an important read and I'd encourage you to seek it out. What stayed with me from this conversation is something Steven said about the subtitle of that report, Who Controls the Story Controls the Future. It's both a diagnosis and a call to action. And as Steven pointed out, the history of people fighting back from the first black newspaper in 1827 to the town halls filling up around data center projects today suggests that story is never fully owned by anyone for long. As mentioned at the top, the latest episode of our sister show is out now, The Political Dispatch, All the President's Men at 50. 50 years on, the film All the President's Men still asks the most important question in journalism. What happens when the press tells the truth and the government tries to cover it up? In the latest episode of The Political Dispatch, I sit down with film scholar Professor John Lewis from Oregon State University to explore the legacy of Watergate on cinema, on the press, and on power. We also hear from Steven, who you've heard from today, talking about whether a Watergate-style investigation could happen in this era of media ownership. If you'd like to listen to that episode, the link is in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode of Spare a Thought, please rate, review, subscribe, and share. Your support amplifies the show to reach new audiences. The theme song for this episode was Young Shall Grow by Afro Cluster, Magugu and Asha Jane. This episode, Spare Thought, Who Owns the Media, was edited by Sam Khanikar. Spare Thought is a Be The Change Media Network production. I'm Tom Spare. Thanks for listening.
Whether you like them or not, young shall grow. Better fill them with love, then them to know. In this life you don't give up, even when you know. If you fall, get back up. Young shall grow. Whether you like them or not, young shall